About 50 years ago, an astronaut returning from the moon experienced things that he couldn't find a scientific explanation for. So, with some colleagues, he launched a new science focused on the mind and how it works in the body and across space and time. It's the field of Noetics, where the tools of modern science are used to help us understand how what we think and feel affects us and the world around us. Now, this is Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments from the studios of KXCR Community Radio in Florence, Oregon.
This is Noetic Moments, where we explore the field of research that discovers what consciousness is, what it does, how it works, and how our lives could be very different if we understood it better. I'm Ruth Miller, a longtime student of consciousness, cybernetics, and anthropology, and through this series of programs, I'm introducing some of the people whose work has defined this field of research, and I'm explaining some of their ideas and their experiments. I'll also explore some relevant news items and answer questions that you send to my email address, ruth@noeticmoments.org. That's NOETICMOMENTS.org. In the world of medicine and psychology, consciousness is usually defined as being awake and aware and knowing what's going on around us, and that is a part of it. But in the field of noetics, we go beyond that. We look at processes and products of the mind, both in our awareness and outside of it. We look at the profound experiences that shape our lives, and ultimately, we explore the possibility that consciousness is what connects us all. Now, so far in this series, we've been looking at a number of models of mind, starting with Freud and Jung in the early 20th century, explaining how much of what goes on in the mind is not in our normal awareness and is, in fact, unconscious. We went ahead into the 60s and looked at Charles Tart's descriptions of the various states of consciousness that we move in and out of, and Julian Jaynes' understanding of consciousness being related to the separation of the right and the left hemispheres of their brain and how they interact. We looked at some of the field models of mind that have been developed to explain how it is that mind affects and is affected by the body and other things faster than nerve signals can travel, through the work of Kurt Levine, Rupert Sheldrake, and others, which then, of course, brought up how quantum mechanics relates to consciousness, as described in the works of David Bohm, Dana Zohar, and Amit Goswami, among many others. We went on to look at the global brain, or noosphere, as described by Peter Russell, Teilhard de Chardin, and Ervin Laszlo. And in the field of transpersonal psychology, we saw how these ideas and understandings are applied in therapy and research. And then we looked at the work of Bruce Lipton and Candace Pert, who have described how hormones and chemicals in the body act as what Candace called molecules of emotion and lead to what Bruce Lipton calls a biology based on our belief system, which led us into what is increasingly called coherence, that state of consciousness in which the heart, the mind, and the emotions are all in alignment. We've explored some of the experimental results supporting these new ideas about consciousness, including things like telepathic communication between two people, experiments that demonstrate that mind does have an impact on matter, and the experience of remote viewing or clairvoyance. Then we talked about the different states of consciousness we move in and through every day, and we explored frequencies and how we adjust into higher and lower frequencies of vibration patterns in the brain and in the heart as we shift from one state of a consciousness to another, with the work of Penny Pierce and the work of Masaru Emoto and the study of cymatics. Then in the last few sessions, we've been looking at the healing process and the role that consciousness and the vibration patterns play in the body's response to threats and distress and its ability to heal itself. You can catch up on those past shows on the KXCR.net archives. Click on the little cloud up on the banner at the top of the KXCR.net screen, and on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where you'll also find links to the clips and books and authors that I mention here on this show. Today we're going to look at Dr. David Hawkins' Map of Consciousness. He's a double doctor. He had an MD in psychiatry and had a major breakthrough in the late 60s, early 70s that caused him to be a presence in which people became healed. So he was getting clients from all over the world, far too many for his office to handle, and he began to burn out. And so he closed his practice and moved to Sedona and got a PhD at the University of Arizona, focusing on how to understand what had happened to him and what could be happening to many other people. Dr. Hawkins wrote a number of books over the years. The one I'm going to be drawing on, and we'll go into some detail today, is Power versus Force, and particularly the map of consciousness that he developed in that book. There's a marvelous explanation of the map on YouTube, and I'll let you hear what this young woman has to say.
Each human body is born with a survival system, and from the moment we're born, we naturally have a defensive and fearing position towards death. The system makes it so. And then not only that, this survival program, governed by amygdala or sympathetic nervous system, makes us experience a whole range of fight or flight responses, which, if we translate into feelings, we're talking about anger, fear, grief, guilt, shame, etc. And these feeling states, if measured by kinesiology, are weakening to our physiological bodily functions. Some thoughts can be so weakening that it can make a person unable to hold one's arm up. The function of the ego actually makes us cling on to these negative states. Our higher self, on the other hand, which governed by the parasympathetic nervous system, helps produce feelings of relaxation, peace, lovingness, compassion, so on and so forth, and these are strengthening feelings. This is what the map of consciousness is. And as you can see, this isn't exactly rocket science. If we look at what psychology, philosophy, neurochemistry, medicine, psychiatry, literature, self-help books point to, there are all kinds of modalities of relieving human suffering, and that is the common theme. What's tricky here is that you can't expect to get rid of the negative feelings. Obviously, you can't just cut off your amygdala. Even if you temporarily get rid of fear, there's always a fear of it coming back. So then transcending towards the higher level of consciousness requires some pretty serious lifelong efforts. We not only have to recognize this conflicting dynamic of the two systems, we also almost have to constantly negotiate with our ego. And that is the process of what David calls letting go or surrendering to God or the truth. Some people may be asking, well, how exactly do we let go? And I think that even just understanding this is already a part of that, because then you're not stuck in the resistance or confusion of why you feel a certain way. You can be a bit more compassionate towards yourself.
Okay, so she was explaining the overall context for this thing called the map of consciousness, which, as she suggested, moves people from the weakening emotions or states of consciousness toward the strengthening ones. Now, what David Hawkins was doing was using what's called applied kinesiology or muscle testing to assign higher or lower ratings in an arbitrary calibration scale that he describes as arbitrary, using whole numbers on a logarithmic scale. So you're going from 0 to 1,000. And his lowest one is despising. The idea is that the infinite, all that is, the universe, God is despising me, and I am miserable. That's the life view. Life is miserable, and what is felt is shame. And the emotion is a sense of humiliation, and people tend to get caught up in eliminating themselves and other beings in that state. Higher than that is vindictive or condemning, disdainful, even vengeful. In the vengeful, if the divine as we understand it is vengeful, then people tend to feel like life is constantly against them, and they're feeling a lot of anger and hatred, and they act out aggressively. The author, Daniel Brinkley, wrote a book about his own life, Saved by the Light, and that's where he was living in the beginning of his life. When we shift from that into scorn and pride, we've actually moved up into something that is more or less a little bit empowering. When we go into permitting and feasible and have courage, and then we are empowering. And my sense is that the founding fathers of this nation were operating pretty much in that area, back and forth between a vengeful God and a permitting and enabling God. So they're feeling everything from anger to courage to willingness, and back down to anger and pride and desire. They're in that range, going back and forth as they're in the process of creating this country that we call the United States today. Moving up David Hawkins' scale, we move into inspiring and hopeful and merciful God, and begin to feel the power of forgiveness, and we begin to transcend stuff of the past and move on beyond it, no longer affected by it, which then allows us to move into a state of wisdom and ultimately love and feeling joy and peace. And finally, his top of his scale, which is 700 to 1,000 points, everything else being 600 and below, he has the idea of God as self, where isness is all that is, and the emotion cannot be described, and the experience is pure awareness, pure consciousness, what the Tibetans call Rigpa in their Buddhist tradition. So the map of consciousness that David Hawkins developed, using applied kinesiology to create a sense of the stages and the levels of power, are heavily described in all of his books, really. But I thought you might like to hear what he has to say about how that is related to our health. So here comes David Hawkins from an old video.
So we see then that health is the willingness to let go of buying into negativity. Why should a person buy into negativity anyway? Why is it some people are so programmable? We know people that go into hysteria every time they open a magazine, and the latest illness sends them into a panic. And it has to do then with the amount of fear and the amount of guilt. The amount of fear is really coming out of the amount of unconscious guilt. It's as though the person knows what to be afraid of. It's as though they're only too aware that because they have so much of this, for them to even hear about it and become mentally programmed is almost enough to make it happen in their life. And so what does this tell us then about the steps towards optimal health? It means the willingness to adopt mental attitudes that are positive and constructive, and this means the willingness to let go of the negative ones. The willingness to take an easygoing, forgiving attitude towards life. The unwillingness to buy into negative programming. The owning of the power of mind. Going into denial and blaming it on out there is giving your power away. We see that these energy fields below courage here are all levels in which the person has become victim. What's happened is they've given their power away and put it on something outside of themselves. And these people in these levels here have said to themselves unconsciously, the source of my happiness is outside of myself. They've put their survival on something outside of themselves. As we move into the levels of truth, above the levels of courage, and the energy fields are now going positive, we see that the person is re-owning their power. The person is saying, I and I alone have the power to create happiness and opportunity in my life. It is coming from within me. And so these people then own that health is something that comes from within. These people are coming from, I am the victim of disease. You see, we are not the victim of viruses. We're not the victim of accidents. We're not the victim of cholesterol. We're not the victim of uric acid levels. We're not the victim of those things. When we re-own our own power, we say, hey, It's my mind that's been creating that. My mind believes that eating liver and kidneys is going to give you a high uric acid level, and that's going to give you an attack of gout. My mind is so powerful that if I believe that, it will literally make it happen. That's a hard thing for many people to accept, that their mind has that much power. You mean to tell me that if I believe that eating sugar and sweets is going to give me hypoglycemia, that'll give me hypoglycemia? Yes, indeed it will. Yes, indeed it will.
So Hawkins is reaffirming what our other research and ideas that we've been sharing on this show seem to assert. And that is that what the mind believes is what the body demonstrates. He's doing that as a psychiatrist who also has a PhD in consciousness studies. What he suggests then for the healing path is to begin to shift out of the level of consciousness that says I am a victim of the world around me to a level of consciousness that is enabling and empowering. I'll let him describe that.
So we have to move to a way of being with ourselves, which is a healing way of being with ourselves. And what I'm talking about is easy to do. It's merely choosing to be compassionate, choosing to be forgiving. Now the decision comes to be that way about myself, to be that way about others. Because if I am that way about others, then automatically I am that way about myself. If I am that way about myself, I automatically become that way about others. See, that which I forgive in others, I automatically am forgiving in myself. Because all I'm seeing out there is myself projected into the world. If I forgive it in myself, then I also forgive it in the world. And so what happens then is the beginning of the undoing of all this negativity, the replacement of all these negative low energies by a positive plus 500 or 540 energy. As we do this, we begin to experience the world and ourselves differently, our relationship to life differently, and we begin to experience an inner joy, an inner joyfulness. When we begin to see the results of our willingness to let go our condemnations of ourselves and others.
So David Hawkins has provided a way to think about how we are being in our lives, in ourselves, and in the world by looking at what we think about divinity, what we think about our relationship to others, what our emotional state is, and how we are acting. With all those things in place, we can see whether we need to move upward in our awareness in order to feel good about our lives and ourselves, in order to be healthy. And this is totally in alignment, as I said earlier, with all of the work we've been doing so far, but it's a useful framework. And he lays this out in several of his books, but particularly in a book called Power versus Force. So that's the one I want to review today. It's available on the veritaspub.com, veritaspub.com website, and you can just click on products and you'll see his books. But it's also available everywhere else, used and new. It was written in 1994. So Hawkins says that he did the research for this starting in 1965, got involved with something called muscle testing or applied kinesiology, and his way of doing it is you hold out your arm, and if something is beneficial to you or true, your arm remains powerful and nobody can easily push it down. But if something that you are thinking about or saying is not true or is not beneficial to you, your arm becomes weak and it's hard to hold it out. So this muscle testing technique is what he's used to test the truth of almost everything that he has written or said. So the book lays out the process for doing that approach, and then he talks about the various ways that he tested it, various ideas in the book, and the fact that he applied this muscle testing approach to every sentence in the book. And in the foreword, he says originally they had John Lennon listed among the celebrities who had killed themselves because of painful levels of consciousness. And the muscle testing said, no, that's not true. And they looked it up. He hadn't realized that Lennon had been assassinated. So they took that out, and the muscle testing was fine after that. And that's one example of how he used it. Well, in 1973, Hawkins says he was involved with Linus Pauling and published the book Orthomolecular Psychiatry. He was still practicing at that time. But then, at the age of 38, he said he had, quote, suddenly met with enlightenment, unquote. And after that is when all the clients began to come to him and he got burned out. So, as I said, in 79, he describes in this book that he moved to Sedona, Arizona to become a hermit, spiritually perfecting himself in silence. But he began to see the value of sharing these ideas. In 94, he published the book Power versus Force. Now, he says in the book, the levels of consciousness, which could also be called energy fields, are calibrated according to their measurable effect in the world. With each progressive rise in the level of consciousness, the frequency or vibration of energy in the consciousness field increases. Thus, higher consciousness radiates a beneficial and healing effect on the world, he says. It was an arbitrary logarithmic scale of whole numbers that emerged through the muscle testing process, and he talked about them as powerful attractor fields within the domain of consciousness itself. Now, attractor is a concept that comes from systems and cybernetics, and Ilya Prigogine was granted the Nobel Prize in the 70s for accomplishing demonstrations of how it works in the formation of what he called dissipative structures. We talked a little bit about those in an earlier session of this program. Hawkins says, the individual human mind is like a computer connected to a giant database. This database is human consciousness itself, of which our own consciousness is merely an individual expression. And we're connecting with Carl Jung in that image, aren't we? He says, unlimited information contained in the database has now been shown to be readily available to anyone in a few seconds at any time and in any place, using the calibration technique that he was using with muscle testing. You ask a question, you get a true or false or helpful or not helpful answer. It's an either or thing. The arm is either strong or weak. And so you can ask anything that offers that yes or no, true or false kind of response. It is possible to lift one's level of consciousness, to enhance one's frequency, as we discovered when we were studying Penny Pierce and the rules of cymatics. And as we do so, then not only are we affecting our own bodies, as Hawkins suggested in the clip earlier, but we are actually affecting the lives of those around us. Well, all right. If you just tuned in, you are listening to Noetic Moments on KXCR, 90.7 on the FM dial, and streaming on KXCR.net. And that sound tells me it's time to look at what's going on in the world today and what you, the listeners, have asked me to talk about. Well, the news today in the month of July of 2022 is pretty alarming, isn't it? If you're paying any attention to the media, any attention to the economics going on around us, any attention to almost any field to focus on, we are dealing with some really distressing kinds of news that is telling us that actually the media has succeeded in shifting the whole world into the fear and drama that is the media's bread and butter. That is what we are seeing. As Hawkins suggested, if we focus on things that connect with our guilt and fear, we get a lot more of the same. It's that feedback loop we talked about in an earlier episode on this show. In order to break out of the fear and guilt and shame that the media is encouraging through these news reports, we need to find other kinds of news to focus on. We need to find other kinds of actions and possibilities in the world to focus on. So while at the same time that the COVID thing is doing what the COVID thing is doing, and Russia is doing what they're doing, and the Supreme Court is doing what they're doing, and so on, all of that is happening. It's not necessarily, for 99% of my listeners, happening in your living room now. It's somewhere out there. It's not here and now. So what is happening here and now? If we're going to live in a world that is falling apart, we need to be able to focus on what it is that's trying to be born in the process. So I strongly encourage you, if you're not familiar with David Hawkins' map of consciousness and you would like to have a guideline, you can go online, you can order it, you can find variations on it, you can pick up the book, Power versus Force, and you'll be able to find a way to monitor where you're at and then use the tools that he provides and we've been providing on this series to help you get out of the fear and shame and guilt that this culture has dragged you into and is going through itself, up into empowerment and ultimately into love and forgiveness. And as you do so, not only will your body start showing up as much more healthy and viable and vibrant, but everyone around you will benefit. Well, that's it for today's show. The next time we get together, we'll look at more of the research being done in an attempt to understand what consciousness is, what it really does, and how we can experience our lives differently when we understand consciousness fully. We are out of time for today, but remember, you can continue the exploration on our website, www.noeticmoments.org, where there's a list of the series and recordings of past shows, and each show has the titles and other resources that we refer to on them with the links. And you can send me your comments and questions, which I will do my best to get answered the next time we're on the air. For now, thanks for joining me here on Noetic Moments at KXCR Community Radio, 90.7 FM in Florence, Oregon. And have a wonderful week.
You've been listening to Dr. Ruth Miller's Noetic Moments. This program is produced in the studios of KXCR Community Radio in beautiful Florence, Oregon, supported by you, our listeners. Our theme music is Tumbling Planets, composed and performed by Jeff Lovejoy. To hear this program again or learn more about Noetic sciences, search our website, www.noeticmoments.org.